You know, I just had knee surgery, so I'm going to sit while I do this. Everybody move so you can see a screen, okay? Turn your back to me. It's okay. I'm just going to be talking to you. Got it? All right. This is really, I badly chose a map because there is no Kurdistan. That's a wishful thinking. But look, I want you to look at that whole Middle East map and see what we're talking about here, because the juxtaposition, the locations of these countries are really important. You can see Israel tiny there, and the West Bank is that orange piece. Can I move? No, can't. Look at where Syria is. Iraq, look at where Iran is. You know, today, if you're reading the news, today is critical for this. So by the time we get out with the time change, by the time we get out of lunch, we're going to know something. Okay, so that's where Iran is, Saudi Arabia down there, Egypt over here. Okay, we'll talk more about what's going on vis-a-vis Israel with those countries. Here's a map of Israel now. So from the top, Golan Heights up there by Lebanon, from the top of Israel to the bottom is 290 miles. But this is what we always, you got to remember, is from, see Beersheba there down in the bottom? Below is the Negev desert. Nobody lives there. Okay, so, well, some people do. 200,000 people, mostly Bedouins and tents running around, but you don't have a population, that is of any density or that anyone's fighting over, because nobody really wants the Negev, or the Palestinians don't. So we're really talking about an area from Beersheba north up to Lebanon. So it's about 150 miles, and at its widest is 85 miles. So we're talking about from Stillwater to Ardmore, and Stillwater over to like 15 miles on the other side of Tulsa. Put 10 million people in that, trying to kill each other. I just want to give you that perspective of what we're talking about. So the West Bank, and the West Bank means the West Bank of the Jordan River, right? The West Bank, as you see, has a little over 3 million. Gaza, which is 25 miles long and 6 miles at its widest across, has 2.2 million, one of the most highly dense populations in the world. And then the rest, 9.7 million. Okay? All right. Here's my issue with this. This really is a war of land, a war of property, and human rights as well, but property certainly, and how much control you actually have over that property. And when looking at that, you need to understand the arguments on either side, and why the Jews think they have a primacy, and why the Palestinians think they do. So first of all, you got to look back at the biblical piece, and we got a lot of preachers in here, so you can give me a better definition of this. But here's the thing: in East Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, is a big part of this. The contentious pieces, and I just want you to remember this, the contentious pieces for the Palestinians are the land that was awarded to them kind of from the beginning and has gone back and forth, and we'll talk more about how it's gone back and forth, is Gaza, that little strip down in the southwest, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank. But Jerusalem is a big, big piece of this. So in biblical times, the Israelites came from Egypt, settled. Ultimately, King David moved, when he took over from Saul, he moved his capital from Hebron to Jerusalem. His son then, Solomon, built the first of the temples. built them on what is now what is called Temple Mount. And that was razed, that was destroyed by the Babylonians. Jews came back in, built another one, destroyed by the Romans a little bit before the birth of Christ. So you had the ruins of the two big Jewish temples there. From the Quran, and people don't understand this, and you need to think about this. Jerusalem is the third most holy site in Islam, whether you're a Sunni or whether you're a Shia. Mecca and Medina first, Jerusalem second, because Muhammad had his night journey, which the way however you read the Quran, whether he dreamed it or whether he actually did it, he journeyed to Jerusalem and there was taken on the back of the white horse, al-Buraq, to God. And he was able to actually converse with God, and they had an argument. He talked God into allowing prayers to be done only 5 times a day instead of 100 times a day as God wanted. Okay, but that makes Jerusalem a big piece. So after the biblical times, when you think about the Romans and what was happening in Palestine, from the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Jews basically were kicked out of that whole area, leaving what were, the local inhabitants there, non-Jews. And in the 8th and 9th centuries then, under the Ottoman Empire, now think about that, the Ottoman Empire took over and ruled that whole area for 4 centuries until the First World War. And it was inhabited by, then under the Ottomans, of course, Muslims. The local people were converted to Islam. And the Palestinians say, we were there, right? There's a tinge on the Palestinians with Jews and Christians because the word Palestine comes from what? The Philistines. And we always think of the Philistines as, kind of bad guys. So take that out of your head. Now, so you had the First World War, but during the First World War, when it was clear that the Brits and the French and the Allies were going to win, we didn't come into the First World War until like the last 5 minutes. So we didn't have anything to say in any of this. But the Brits and the French, the Italians and the Russians did. And there were 2 diplomats, a Brit and a French, who were given the responsibility of deciding where the boundaries were going to go and dividing up what had been the Ottoman territory. They literally took pencil and paper and a ruler and said, well, okay, where there's not a river, let's just draw a straight line. You had absolutely the entire area drawn at random. So what you had were tribes, were all kinds of folks, and 99% Muslims and Arabs, but Arabs who'd been fighting each other anyway, given really random borders. During the Second World War and more toward the end of it, and then in 1917 it was made public, Lord Balfour, Arthur Balfour, who was the foreign minister in Britain. It's amazing what the Brits thought they could get away with, in terms of ruling the world. So he was friends with what were then the Zionists. Now the Zionists, the Jewish Zionists, started coming in back into what they termed the Holy Lands in the late 1800s. There were big Zionist movements in Europe and in the United States, and they started moving in, but not in big numbers. But they were looking for a homeland. And the Brits did not want the Jews to come to England at all, or really to be in any of their other land. And so Balfour wrote a letter upon which foreign policy was based, to Rothschild, who was head of the big Jewish Zionist movement in England, with the promise of, here are the words, the promise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. not instead of Palestine, but in Palestine. There's a lot of back and forth on what that actually means, and the Brits purposefully left it very, very open. So then after the war, and I'm not going to go through all the details of this, after the war, what happened was the Brits were allowed to take over what was the British mandate of the Palestinian territory. So that territory that is now Israel, that flat bottom because Sykes and Picot drew a rulered line across it, and then the Jordan River on the east. They were given the mandate to watch over and basically provide the government for that area until it could be self-governing. At the time of that, look at the population, 1919. At the time of that, 79% of that was Arab Muslim. So 760,000 people there, 11% Jewish, 10% other. So Jewish immigration began, and it largely from Europe. It brought an additional 100,000. Now, there are two other terms that you're going to see in the news a lot when you talk about Israel. The Jews back in the dispersion, when they were forced out of their homeland, part went up to Europe and part went to Northern Africa and Spain. So those who were in Europe and in what is now Russia are called the Ashkenazi Jews. Those that were in Spain and Northern Africa are the Sephardic. The Sephardim, these folks in Africa and Spain complain now. Of course, now they're all back in Israel. They really complain about a lot of discrimination against them, that the Ashkenazis are so much in power. I just want you to be aware of that as you read the news. So Jewish immigration came, brought another 100,000. In 1930s, Germany with another 250,000, even at the beginning of the war, before the war started. So here you have all of these Arabs who have been living in this territory and owning this property for 500 years. And all of these Jews now are coming in and beginning, in fact, to outnumber them, taking over their property, a lot of violence at that time. And the Arabs then, from 36 to 39, incited what is referred to in history as the Arab Revolt against the Jewish dominance. Out of that came the Haganah. And the Haganah were the Israeli military forces who joined the Brits to basically fight the Arabs. And during that time, it's important, became the first exile of Arab males. Now, I want you to watch this too, because this is an important, really important concept in this ceasefire talks that are going on. The Palestinians have always said that part of their demand is right of return. And what that means is any Palestinian who was exiled from this point on and is still alive has the right to return to Palestine. The Israelis say absolutely not. Right now, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Right now, there have been more than 4 million Palestinians over the years since this time that have been exiled. The Israelis say, no right of return in any way, because if that many people come back, there would be more Arabs than there are Israelis, than there are Jews. Okay? That's a real important concept to understand in this. So, in 39 then, the Jews had started working on the Brits. And the Brits didn't like it. There was a lot of bias a lot of anti-Semitism going on in Britain. They didn't want tax dollars paid for taking care of Jews in Palestine. And so the Brits wrote a white paper, there you go, limiting Jewish immigration to 75,000 over the next 5 years. It took about 5 minutes to get 75,000 people there. They got there really fast. So they closed the door on immigration in the late part of 39. They denied Jewish ownership of property, guarantee of the Jewish homeland, all of that. But they did say that they stuck with that Balfour Agreement, that a Jewish homeland needed to be established within the Palestinian independent state within 10 years, but not an independent Jewish state. And these terms go back and forth in all of this. During the Second World War, so 39 to 46, Haganah, this Jewish military group, was fighting against the British, really. Everybody wanted the Brits out. The Haganah joined Irgun and Lehi. Irgun and Lehi were no bones about it, terrorist organizations, Jewish terrorist organizations. Interestingly, the Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, Lehi, led by Shamir. So 2 prime ministers that later became prime minister were head of 2 terrorist organizations. And I mean these were nasty guys. If you've ever read the book, the Leon Uris book, Exodus, or seen the movie, this is what that's about. This is Irgun and Lehi fighting against the Brits to get them out of there and declare the Palestinian mandate then under British control. And they fought the Brits in every kind of terrorist way: assassination, bombings, explosions, killing people on the street. They assassinated. Let me just stop here and say that one of the Jews, the Israelis, and the Jews then, Israelis now, prime tactics is assassination. It's been a very stated, very clear tactic that they approve from the get-go, because they say we're not big enough, to amass a whole army against you. So the only way we can go is assassinating leadership, and that's what they did with the Brits. So the Irgun blew up the King David Hotel, which was the whole British headquarters. Huge thing, lots of folks killed, and the Brits then, back home, are having to justify staying in Britain, and they can't do it anymore. Everybody's tired of war. The Second World War is over, and the last thing the Brits want to do then is keep boots on the ground in some place they didn't care about. They sure didn't want tax money, their British tax money, being paid to take care of these folks, and so they said, you got to come home, we got to end the British mandate. So the Brits declared the end of the British mandate. The newly formed UN in 47 then, this is really important, voted to partition Palestine. They said there's going to be an independent Jewish state and there's going to be an independent Palestinian state, and the city of Jerusalem will be an international territory under UN control. So the Palestinian property was going to be split, Gaza as it is now and the West Bank as it is now, okay? They did concede East Jerusalem then to the Palestinians as well, so they could have part of Jerusalem as part of the West Bank. The Jews said, okay, let's do it. We want our independence. And of course the Jews from the beginning, and they're saying all along, we intend to roust out the Arabs. We'll get rid of them, but okay, give us the land. And the Arabs refused to sign. So in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who had been head of the Jewish Agency, which was the government of the Jewish group, the Jewish community there, declared the establishment of the State of Israel, and we supported them. It was important because we were very important in the UN there, in the creation of the UN, and the UN had just been started, and so with our support, Ben Gurion stood on a balcony in Jerusalem and announced the establishment of the state, and the UN voted for it. And so he was elected the first prime minister. So that just pissed off every Arab in the area. And Egypt, Syria, and Jordan came in and invaded Israel. And I'm not going to go through all these details because you have years now of war up to the present where all of this property has been swapped back and forth. But the property, and let me just go back up to this map of Israel, the property that's always in contention are the Golan Heights, which are up in the north. See the Lebanese border? The Golan Heights. Now, all of this now belongs to Israel, but it went back and forth, and I'm not going to go through the Yom Kippur Wars and the Six-Day War and all of that, but you had the Golan Heights. Jordan actually went in and took the West Bank. That's another terrific story about the monarchy of Jordan. Gaza was an issue, and the Sinai was an issue. You see the Sinai there with Egypt? Okay? That's the whole border down there. So those are the territories that were always in contention, that went back and forth. So you had this. Let me go. Wait a minute. Back up here. One more. So you had Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and Iraq coming in. All of this territory was taken from Israel. And in 1964, the Palestinians, who were always in the mix here and always wanting their property and wanting it to be under their control, formed the Palestinian Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat, one of the great, great leaders of the Arab world. Smart as could be, and it was founded to do one thing: confront Israel. In other words, get our property back and make us independent. And Yasser Arafat, at one time we declared the PLO a terrorist organization. Yasser Arafat was not only good at leading the PLO, he was also good at getting support from the other Arab nations around. The Palestinians are not good at that, and we'll talk about why that is. Now, so you had the Six-Day War, another switch of territory. Attacks continued on both sides. The PLO was nasty. The Israelis were nasty. You had the Yom Kippur War. Thousands were killed. Golda Meir lost her prime ministership because of that. And the UN gives the PLO legitimacy, even though we declared it a terrorist organization. They gave it legitimacy as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. So they really became, and Yasser Arafat became the voice of the Palestinians. Now, remember here, the Palestinians have no place else to go. All of those Palestinians that have left have all gone to Jordan. Jordan, folks, is a Palestinian country. The Queen is a Palestinian. It is made up of Palestinians. There was nothing there before, okay? So remember that. Menachem Begin, who remember was leader of the Irgun, did go to Camp David with Anwar Sadat, who was president of Egypt. Terrific guy. And Israel gave up the Sinai. They agreed to negotiate autonomy for the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. These two folks won the the Academy Award. They won the Nobel Prize for this. It was really being taken seriously. However, Menachem Begin was taken out of office by more conservatives who didn't have any intention of honoring any of that. So that was the end of that. In 79 to 87 then, you really saw the Israelis with a new government, very conservative government, saying, not only do we want to the Palestinians out, but the land that they've been given, we're going to incentivize settlement, Jewish settlement. And they began really heavily incentivizing Jews to settle in the West Bank, property that had been very much Palestinian up until that time. So, what did the Palestinians do? But basically declare the first Intifada, and the Intifada is simply the Palestinians' military intent, military action to take back their Palestinian lands. Okay, so Palestinians revolted, and in '93, I remember this so clearly, but President Clinton had negotiated it. The fighting got so bad, so many thousands had been killed, that both sides basically said, we've had it. And you had Yitzhak Rabin as a prime minister who was not as conservative as those before him. And like so many countries, that prime ministership had gone back and forth. Okay, so he and Arafat met. They agreed that if the Palestinians would recognize Israel as a state, that Israel then would give them dominance and really governorship over the Palestinian what lands had been, and that the PLO would give up, would demilitarize was the term, and they did it. And what Yasser Arafat did was he disbanded the terrorist organization of PLO, and in the West Bank, because that's the big area of Palestinians, he transformed the PLO into the Palestinian National Authority. And that was the governing body, and this, if you don't understand anything else, you need to understand this. That was the governing body for the Palestinians. It was headquartered in the West Bank, and he ran both Gaza and the West Bank out of that under his governance. Unfortunately, however, Rabin was assassinated, and Arafat died in 2004, and Mahmoud Abbas took over the PNA. And he does not, and he is still the head of the Palestinians in the West Bank. And he has gotten old and sick, and he does not have the charisma or the leadership, anything that Arafat had. And in 2007, Gaza was becoming discontent with the West Bank governance. And Hamas, well, here's another term you need to know. The Palestinians in the West Bank, the PNA or the PDA, both ways, is the head of the governance of the government. But they have a political wing called Fatah. So when you hear about Fatah, that is the Palestinians in the West Bank. So you had Fatah, and in Gaza, however, they were really angry because they were getting the short stick all the way around. And the Israelis were really taking it out on them because you had Israeli settlements in the West, so you really couldn't fight against them or attack them. So they were doing everything to Gaza. So the Palestinians in Gaza allowed to be elected to run Gaza a terrorist organization called Hamas. It's an acronym for striking back. So Hamas then was in Gaza. The PNA in much more liberal and much more accepting of Israeli dominance in the West Bank, and they didn't get along. They don't get along now, they didn't get along then, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. Mahmoud Abbas, who Israel recognizes as the voice of the Palestinians, has no power. It is Hamas, okay? So let me just get you through this. A big thing that happened then was Netanyahu came into power in 2009. He's been, during that time, in and out of power back into power in 21, and is the prime minister now. So let me just go through this really fast. Israeli and Palestinians both fighting for their survival. No place to go if you lose. The Palestinians have always been promised the land initially that they were given after the Palestinian Mandate, and the Israelis do not want them there. Israel has basically occupied the West Bank, so the Palestinians have little control and actually little property there. Let me just go through here. In revolt on 7th of October 2023, you all realize that the Hamas came over the wall. Now, Israel had so confined the Palestinians in Gaza that it became what is internationally known as the open air prison. It is totally under blockade and has been since Hamas gained control in 2007. They cannot travel out, no one can travel in. Now they have absolutely no import or export capability. They are starving. If you can't grow it in Gaza, and you've seen pictures of Gaza, you don't eat. No, absolutely not. They've closed that Egyptian border. And people ask, well, why don't the Egyptians take these people? Why don't they just open the door and let the Palestinians come? Egypt has the worst economy in the Middle East, and it took 7 million Syrian refugees. It is foundering. Jordan is full of Syrian refugees. They're not going to take anybody. Syria, my goodness, I mean, you wouldn't want to go to Syria. I mean, it is under total disarray. So there's no place for anybody to go. So in response, the Palestinians came over the wall and raided. There was a music festival up in the West Bank. They raided. They took about 240 hostages, killed 1,200 Israelis and foreigners who were there brutally. And they killed a number of those hostages, so that today, I'll skip forward, and there's been back and forth about all this, about how many hostages were left. I heard this morning they say there are 114 Israelis, one foreigner, 114 unaccounted for. A lot of those people will be dead. I can't imagine them taking a lot of them are young women. I can't imagine the Palestinians taking young women and allowing them ever to be released and tell stories. It just is not going to happen. So, part of this negotiation, of course, is over the hostages. In response, to that, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, went full bore into Gaza and basically have leveled it. Yeah? You still have those 2.2 million people being told, okay, you're safe in the south, and they all run to the south, and then they bomb the south. You're safe in the north, they all run, and the IDF believes that in finding Hamas uses, and they do, there's 3,000 miles of tunnels under Gaza, that they protect themselves by using human shields of hospitals and schools. So what Israelis have done then, the IDF has done, is bomb the schools, the refugee centers, the tent camps, everything, because that's where the Hamas leadership is, and indeed it may be. So here we are today with a very conservative prime minister and government running Israel. Let me talk a little bit about Netanyahu. As I say, he's been prime minister for 15 years off and on. He's the only government he's been able to form is with Likud, which is the extreme right wing in Israel. A problem with Netanyahu is he is under indictment. Not only under indictment, he is being charged and tried Three trials are going on against him. High criminal trials for bribes, fraud, embezzlement, you name it, he's being charged with it, and looks like a lot of good evidence for it. But he cannot go to prison as long as he remains president. He can only remain president if Israel is at war. Yeah, we tend to forget this. He can only remain president as long as Israel is at war. So, the question is, does he want to keep it at war? So he has said, absolutely, I don't really want to negotiate. And Biden, when Biden presented this plan that they're talking about today, Biden said it's also the Israeli plan. And Netanyahu said yesterday, not my plan. My plan is to obliterate Hamas any way I can do it. And that's all we're talking about. So, and the other piece to this is Iran, and we're running out of time, and let me just tell you this because you're going to listen to the news tonight. So, you have all these hostage negotiations happening, ceasefire happening. Hamas has said absolutely we will not release prisoners until there is a ceasefire. Israel says we don't want a ceasefire because that gives Hamas time to regroup. So we will not have a ceasefire. In the meantime, Israel says, yeah, but we want to have these negotiations. But ultimately, on the 30th of July, they assassinated the Hamas negotiator in these ceasefire talks. He was in Tehran because of the new inauguration of the new president there, and he was killed. So what Israel did not realize, they thought that a guy named Mashal would be brought in then as president to replace Hedwig, who was killed and who they assassinated in Tehran. But as it turns out, Hamas decided, oh, no, we're going to bring in the real bad guy who is Yahya Sinwar is his name, and elect him as our leader. And he doesn't want anything but the obliteration of the Israelis. Now, today, they have not announced who was going to be the listener on the Hamas side. This morning, the ceasefire hostage negotiation talks were to begin in Doha. They began, but they did not include Hamas. Hamas said, we're not coming. But what we will do is once you decide with Israel what the proposal is, then we'll listen. And then we will send that, now always before the Hamas leaders have lived outside of Gaza to give them greater mobility. Sinwar is in the tunnels in Gaza because he says, I'm here to fight and to kill. So whatever is decided today out of those ceasefire talks has got to be sent back into Gaza, into the tunnels to Sinwar. He decides what's going to happen and gets the message back. Don't hold your breath, I mean, it'll happen, but it'll happen later. So now what the Israelis are saying is, well, let me tell you what the U.S. is saying. The U.S. is saying we need a 3-stage peace talk. And, it's the U.S., it's the Secretary of State, and it's the head of the CIA that are negotiating this because we are so close to Mossad. So, I'm sorry, everybody. Can you give me 2 minutes and I'll finish? So,
what? Let's go ahead. If anybody needs to leave,
yeah, go ahead. And
go
leave.
right ahead, and we will.
Don't feel like you have to.
We will say thank you to Meredith, but she can continue and stay and answer all sorts of questions. Continue with her talk.
Let me just finish this. So, I'm sorry, I talked too long. So what's happening now is Biden has said, or the U.S. has said, 3 stages. The first is a ceasefire. You got to. We've got to at least not be shooting at each other while we have this conversation. First is a ceasefire. The second then is the Palestinians need to release hostages, and the Israelis need to release Palestinian hostages in return. And then we need to talk about property settlement. What's going to happen? Who gets what? Netanyahu has said, "Nah, I'm going, to the end of this." And the way Netanyahu has done it is, parts of the government has said, "Okay, we need to do this because we need to stop killing people." But Netanyahu has said, "Well, let's add this demand onto it." And every time they sit, the Israelis add another demand. So we'll see what happens today. And of course, none of this is public, so we don't know. So watch the news tonight. See what happens. Was that reasonably clear? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Oh.
I am on the edge of my seat to hear the end of
yeah.
the story. I can't wait to hear the end of the story.
Oh, and let me talk about just a second why this is important to us. Why is it important to us? Iran decides, in Iran and Hezbollah, Hezbollah is the Iranian proxy in Lebanon. They sit right over the border in Lebanon, so all of the northern part of Israel is under Hezbollah rocket attack, if necessary. And Iran. Iran sent 300 missiles into Israel in April. The Israel Iron Dome, and we, swatted them down. Iran now is trying to figure out what it's going to do, because it has said, we support the Palestinians. And Palestinians Hamas and Iran don't really get along that well, but Iran does support them. And Iran is saying, we are willing to go to war, because in Iran, they are losing popularity, and they have got to show their strength. And if they get sucked up by the Israelis and look like they are letting the Israelis win to their own people, the Iranians, they're going to lose their popular stance. So Iran's between a rock and a hard place. We're between a rock and a hard place because we've got half of Congress saying, stop sending stuff to Israel and tell them they can't be killing people like they are, right? But our government, why are we there? We're there because Israel is our only foot in the Middle East, and because we have a Jewish voting lobby that is very strong, and it's an election year.
Meredith Woodruff for Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Thank you again.